John, it's great to see you. You spent 28 years at the CIA doing covert intelligence work overseas, and you specialized in Russia. What do you see? What's going on today?
What's going on today is something that a lot of us who worked on Russian espionage issues actually expected. Vladimir Putin is probably more consistent than we've been. We continue in the West, continue to think that, if we just communicate better, he'll come around, or maybe he'll change, or maybe the economy is something he'll focus on, and therefore he'll change from sort of this nationalistic view. And frankly, he's been more consistent over time than we have. We continue to not push back effectively and assume that things will work out for the best. And I think one thing about the Ukraine war is it has taken sort of the blinders off of us in the West. And a lot of us who've always known that Vladimir Putin is evil and the system is evil are now seeing that that's in fact the case, and he can't really be negotiated with.
But you've seen Russia since the 90s and the Soviet period and today. Well, how has Russia changed, though? There must be some changes in how their intelligence service operates.
Well, there's some practical changes that I can get into, but, I think there's more consistency over time, frankly, than there is changes over time. Russia started with revolutionary roots. Its leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, those were all cover names because they were underground terrorists fighting against the czars. And countries that spring from revolutionary roots focus on regime security more than national security. And so that's something we have to understand when we think about Russia. In the West, we think about national security, and it's part of sort of our process. There, everything is about keeping the leadership in power at all costs. So Russian intelligence has a overseas focus. It's very important. It's always been very robust, but really it's about domestic security. It's about making sure there's no opposition domestically whatsoever. It's about keeping the leader in the Kremlin in the Kremlin. And it's changed over the years. Vladimir Putin has created a system that's very personal and very much like a dictator. Back in the Soviet system, as repressive and awful as that was, they did have a system. They had a Politburo and an ideology. And if some leader had made a strategic mistakes like Putin has made, the Politburo could have tossed them out and put somebody else in. Now it's quite dangerous because there's no opposition. There's no opposition party. There's nobody standing in the wings. It's these sort of either Vladimir Putin or bust.
So that's really interesting. But Russia's got a massive intelligence service and operates globally. Do you think this war, when you see the failures it had, the Russians really thought they would go in and take Ukraine quickly. What happened? Why did they fail?
I think there's an overlap of reasons of why they failed. And some of them are, you see in other dictatorships, some of them are very Russia-focused. I think Vladimir Putin has created this anti-Western narrative that he's lived with for a long time. And he's been in power now for more than 20 years. The people around him are from the same background. They're all KGB officers or people that he's enriched. And therefore, they know exactly what he wants to hear. They understand, how he operates. They're not going to come to him and tell him that he's going in the wrong direction. And so when you're a dictator in power for that long, you tend to get circular reporting. You get the same thing, but you want to hear. There's also a sense of terrible corruption in Russia, as you're well aware. So, of course, they've tried to reform their military and put money into their military, but at the same time, all of the people around Putin and at high levels want to get their cut and make money off that. So when there's a new weapon system, you can be sure that the minister and everybody down through the system is taking their cut so they can buy their yachts and their big fancy houses. And so it's a variety of both corruption. It's this sort of Russian, nationalist narrative that Vladimir Putin wants to hear, and people don't want to tell him something differently. And he's got this incredibly small cadre of people around him who think exactly the same way he does.
Inside of Russia itself, what do you think of the fissures? What's going on with Putin? What is the risk that there's some radical political change tomorrow in Moscow?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, this is quite dangerous. He's created a system that's dependent on him, and there's a massive security infrastructure that's about keeping him in power. It's sort of trying to coup-proof the system. And like all dictators, what they fear most is their own people, right? And so it's a real danger, and probably the worst thing that can happen to the Russian citizens is that he's created a system that depends totally on him. Again, like in the past, there might have been a Politburo that could have got rid of a bad leader. The system would have continued without him. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, we luckily avoided a Yugoslavia-type terrible civil war, which could have broken out across the Russian landmass. Now, you got to wonder if Vladimir Putin is out of power, there's no political means by which others or people can follow in behind him. It could be a terrible, infighting or even a civil war that he leaves behind in his wake. And so it's a really, really dangerous situation that Vladimir Putin has created, not just for the rest of the world, but frankly for Russians too.
So let me ask you one final question. When you look at all this, should the West then seek to overthrow Putin, or should we wish him to stay in power? What should our goals be?
I think there's a little bit too much focus in the West on what happens if Putin loses. We don't want to give the Ukrainians F-16s because it might cross a red line and make Putin act, or we don't want to give them this weapon system or that weapon system. I think there's almost a fear that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will be too successful, and therefore, Putin may fall out of power or something may happen in Russia. But frankly, this is really silly. The United States and the West cannot impact what happens inside Russia. We shouldn't try to overthink this. We should focus right now on destroying the Russian army and kicking them out of Ukraine. Thinking about trying to manipulate what happens so that Putin stays in power, but he's weakened, or that, the right person comes in or not. This is not the kind of thing we can dictate or focus on. Right now, Vladimir Putin needs to lose and lose badly. And frankly, in a system like his, like I mentioned, that's very coup-proof and has a massive security system to protect himself, and he fears his own people, there needs to be a humiliating loss. There needs to be, Russian troops fleeing back across the border, telling people what's happening in Ukraine. And only then will there be possible change in Russia that can move in a direction that will be beneficial to all of us in the West.
John, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for your service to America.
Thank you much. Appreciate it. It's great to talk to you.